Hideki Tojo symbolized Japanese militarism and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor like no one else. His distinctive look, bald, glasses, and always in military uniform, became characteristic and was often ridiculed by American wartime propaganda. His name, Tojo, became synonymous with Japanese militarism and the attack on Pearl Harbor, viewed by almost every American as an unforgivable, outrageous attack by an aggressive, militaristic empire. However, a common mistake made by many people, both back then and nowadays, is that they assumed Tojo was basically the Japanese equivalent of Hitler, an unchecked dictator ruling with an iron fist over his country. While it is true that Tojo enjoyed a lot of power, being not only the Prime Minister of Japan between October 1941 and July 1944, but also the Minister of the Army, the Minister of Ammunitions, the Minister of Commerce, the Minister of Education, the President of the Imperial Rural Assistance Association, and even for a few months the Chief of the Japanese Army General Staff. Yes, he held a lot of offices. He was only powerful because he was backed by other powerful figures in the Japanese army. You could probably make an entire video about the exact power structures that kept Tojo in office, but that's not the point of this video. As long as Japan achieved victories, Tojo's power was firm. But when the tide of war turned against Japan, so did his backers. And Tojo was forced to resign, which happened on July 22, 1944. So, for the last 390 days of World War II, Tojo was not the Japanese leader. But who was it? It has always been super fascinating to me that the US, after July 1944, was fighting a war against a country whose leader no one knew, both back then and even today. So I wanted to briefly talk about the man who followed Tojo, Kuniaki Koiso, the Japanese Prime Minister between July 1944 and April 1945. This video is not primarily about Tojo, so I won't go too much into detail about him, but what drove the final nail in the coffin was the terrible Japanese defeat in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where Japan lost 2 fleet carriers, 1 light carrier, and over 500 planes, while American losses were a mere single damaged battleship and 120 destroyed planes. This, together with the loss of Saipan, was enough for Japan's military leadership. They dropped Tojo, and even the Japanese emperor was no longer willing to protect them. Tojo knew that he had to resign, although he did not want to, but there was no one left to support him. He first resigned as Chief of Staff of the Japanese Imperial Army on July 16th, a position he only took over in February of 1944, in a desperate attempt to turn the war into Japan's favor by taking personal control over military operations, and then finally announced his and his cabinet's resignation 2 days later, on July 18th, 1944. This message hit like a bomb with the American public. The man that ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Day of Infamy, as President Roosevelt famously called it in his speech, was gone, ousted from power because the American military inflicted defeat after defeat on Japan. The Detroit Times, on their July 18th issue, put as their top headline, "Tojo fired as army head." Also, I have to add this here, this is from a really random small-town American newspaper from the same day, and their headline just reads, "Admiral Hideki Tojo, top Jap Nabbo, gets walking papers. Pearl Harbor sneak smash hero loses job." This is just super funny to me, like the wording, and of course the fact that Tojo wasn't even an admiral but rather general, so I just had to add this in here. A few days later, when Tojo's resignation as Prime Minister became public, the Monitor leader, a local newspaper from Michigan, titled this, "Tojo ousted as dictator of Japan." Now, of course, the assassination attempt on Hitler took the prime spot here, but it was still the headline, and it was a major talking point. Everyone heard, and celebrated, about Tojo stepping down. The war wasn't won yet, but Tojo was gone. This was a major victory. Together with Admiral Yamamoto, who was killed by American forces a year earlier when his plane was shot down, the 2 men responsible for Pearl Harbor were now both gone. Now, who followed Tojo? General Kuniaki Koiso. Born in March 1880 as the son of a former samurai and police inspector of the Japanese prefecture of Tochigi, north of Tokyo, Koiso enrolled in the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1898, graduating in 1900. An infantry officer, Koiso fought in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05 in which he was promoted to captain in 1905. Several other assignments followed as he rose through the ranks, including being a staff officer of the Kwantung Army, the Imperial General Staff Headquarters, and other positions, until his first major assignment, becoming commander of the 51st Infantry Division in August 1923. He eventually, like many other Japanese generals, ended up in politics, being Vice Minister of War between February 1932 and August 1934. As such, he played a crucial role in the Japanese occupation of Manchuria. He also took part in the March 1931 failed coup attempt, both details that will become important later on. An assignment as commander of the Japanese forces in Korea between December 1935 and July 1938 determined his future career. Leaving active military duty in July 1938 after almost 38 years of service, he was Minister of Colonial Affairs between April and August 1939, and again between January and July 1940. Keep the fact that he left active duty in 1938 in mind, it will become important later on. The position he was best known for was Governor General of Korea. Between May 1942 and July 1944, he administered the colony. This is where his nickname, the Tiger of Korea, came from. Under the slogan Naisen Ittai, which roughly translates to Japan and Korea as one body, he promoted the appointment of Korean officials, encouraged Korean-owned enterprises, and sought to expand political participation among Koreans, although he was firmly opposed to the idea of Korean independence, sawing Korea's future firmly under Japan's control. What he was best remembered for was introducing universal conscriptions on Koreans in August 1943, forcing tens of thousands of young Korean men to fight and die for Japan. Needless to say, this policy was hugely unpopular among Koreans, who did not want to fight for the imperial ambitions of their occupiers. Now, how did he end up becoming Prime Minister? As mentioned earlier, after the fall of Saipan, Tojo was forced to resign. A few influential elderly statesmen, former prime ministers, advisors to the emperor and military leaders met and discussed potential successors. In the end, they agreed on 3 names. General Hisaichi Terauchi, commander of the Southern Expeditionary Army Group, responsible for all military operations in Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific campaigns. By July 1944, this formation had 40 divisions, the majority in Burma and New Guinea, with around 1 million men under its command, involved in heavy fighting in Burma, New Guinea, and Western Pacific, and anxiously awaiting the upcoming American invasions of the Philippines. The second choice was General Shunryu Hata, commander of the China Expeditionary Army, responsible for all military operations in China. It also had around 40 divisions with around 1.1 million men, and another 900,000 local collaboration forces. They were in a slightly better position than the Southern Expeditionary Army Group, with July 1944 marking the height of Operation Ichigo, the largest Japanese land offensive of the war. However, Tojo and the army leadership were against recalling Terauchi and Hata, as both were involved in heavy fighting and were considered irreplaceable at their respective command. Thus, the choice fell on Koiso, who was supported by former Prime Ministers Admiral Yonai and Hiranuma. However, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, Koichi Kido, a powerful advisor to the emperor, disliked Koiso due to his previous involvement in a failed coup of March 1931. The emperor himself also did not particularly like Koiso for similar reasons, and he considered Koiso too inexperienced, but since he was the only candidate that was both available and had some form of support, he agreed. Now, initially Koiso was tasked with forming a cabinet alone, but he had no strong political connections and was long removed from central politics. So it was agreed, on the suggestion of former Prime Minister Konoe, that Koiso was to form a coalition with Admiral Yonai, an influential navy politician. This was also to overcome the navy's objection to Koiso's appointment. He was an army general after all, and the interbranch rivalry meant that the navy would not support an army candidate.
焦燥に陥らず沈着冷静おのおのそのことに茶しその持ち場において一瞬の油断することもなくあらゆる困苦を克服してその全力を国家奉仕に貢献せられんことを切望してなりません。
From the start, Koiso's position was extremely weak. He had no strong power base in Japan, the navy did not like him, the army preferred someone else, the emperor wasn't really on his side, and most importantly, he was not an active member of the Japanese military. Remember when I told you Koiso retired from active military service in July 1938? Turns out, this was a perfect way for the Japanese military to keep him away from power and information. For example, Koiso tried to attend Imperial General Headquarter meetings. These were meetings with the top leadership of the army and navy with the emperor, where the general Japanese war strategy was discussed and decided. It would seem reasonable for the Japanese prime minister to attend these meetings. But since these meetings were only open to active, serving army officers, the army simply refused Koiso to attend any of these meetings. When Tojo was prime minister, this was not a problem, as he was an active, serving army general. But Koiso was on the reserve list, no longer in active service. It literally took an imperial order, which was only issued on March 16, 1945, to finally allow the Prime Minister of Japan to take part in meetings of the imperial headquarters. Now, Koiso tried a few different things to bring the war to a successful conclusion. He tried to make peace with China, but the man he approached, Miao Bin, who claimed to have ties to He Ying-quin, the Minister of Defense of the Republic of China, was a bit suspicious, and Japanese Foreign Minister Shigemitsu presented evidence that Miao Bin was somewhat of an imposter, without any real contact to the Chinese government, and Koiso had to drop that plan. His main strategy against the Allies was to force the US to sue for peace by delivering a decisive blow against the American forces landing in the Philippines, which led to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, by some criteria the largest naval battle in history, during which the Japanese lost 26 ships, including 4 carriers. The Americans suffered some casualties, 11 ships and 255 planes in total, including a light carrier and 2 escort carriers, but that was just a tiny fraction of the around 300 ship-strong American fleet. The idea of delivering a single, devastating blow to American forces had to be abandoned, and instead, the Japanese tried to exhaust and bleed out the American forces in a war of attrition. Koiso tried, on several occasions, to become army minister to influence Japan's military strategy more directly, but these moves were blocked by the Japanese military. Only an active service member could become army minister per the Japanese constitution, and Koiso was not an active soldier. On September 7, 1944, Koiso issued the Koiso Declaration, which expressed Japan's intention to recognize the future independence of Indonesia from the Dutch. This was aligning with the general Japanese policy at the time, which tried to get local natives from Dutch and British colonies to fight for them by promising them independence after the war. And while the Koiso Declaration had some impact on post-war independence fighting in Indonesia, it had little effect on the war itself. In the end, all of Koiso's attempts failed, and he could only watch on helplessly as Japan lost more and more ships, troops, material, and territory. Perhaps the most important project Koiso tried during his tenure was the creation of a general staff, a single, unified command of both the army and navy to finally overcome the fierce rivalry between the two services. However, this was strongly opposed by the navy, who saw this as the effective subordination of naval command authority to the army. The army then suggested that the chief of the general staff be a navy commander, and the emperor himself suggested Admiral Yonai should fill that position, but Yonai declined, so that plan went nowhere. Instead, something called the Supreme Advisory War Council was established in August 1944, which was only an advisory body without any actual command power, effectively achieving nothing. In one of the meetings of this council, the Vice Chief of Staff of the Imperial Japanese Army, General Hata, literally told Koiso to shut up, or to quote, "A prime minister who knows nothing of modern warfare shouldn't speak up." This was a clear humiliation by the army, showing how little they respected Koiso, and how little they cared about his opinion or advice. Ironically, that advisory council would eventually play a crucial role in the decision of accepting the unconditional surrender, but that was long after Koiso was gone. Rumors circulating in the army leadership was that Koiso's cabinet would be finished within 2 months. It lasted a bit longer. When General Sugiyama, the army minister, was appointed commander of the newly created 1st Area Army in early April 1945, a newly set up army tasked with defending the Japanese mainland, a new army minister had to be appointed. Koiso again tried to take the position for himself, but at a meeting that was attended by the Chief of Staff of the Navy and Army and Sugiyama, it was decided that General Anami would become the new army minister. This decision, again made without even consulting Koiso, was the final nail in the coffin. Combined with the landing of American forces in Okinawa, e.g. an island that was considered part of the Japanese mainland for the first time, Koiso and much of the cabinet resigned on April 7, 1945, after 269 days in office. He was followed by Baron Kantaro Suzuki, a 77-year-old, respected former admiral, who was directly chosen by order of the emperor, and had the important task to bring the war to a conclusion. He enjoyed much more respect and trust than Koiso, especially from the emperor, and as a respected elderly statesman, he had much more authority in his cabinet. Koiso, already 65 years old, retired into private life. He was eventually arrested by the Americans in November 1945 and put on trial by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. He was convicted for his role in the Japanese conquest of Manchuria, as well as for the fact that he did nothing to prevent war crimes from happening during his tenure as prime minister. Ironically, the Allied judges here believed that as a prime minister, Koiso had the power to stop war crimes from happening, while in reality, even if he wanted to, there was most likely nothing he could do to prevent such war crimes. Sentenced to life in prison, he died of cancer in November 1950, aged 71, after his wife already passed away in April of the same year. As mentioned in Chapter 1, the ousting of Tojo was a major headline in the US. The main man responsible for Pearl Harbor was gone. Tojo has been a household name in the US ever since the attack on Pearl Harbor. Not in a good way, of course. After the Japanese surprise attack on the American fleet, the American public quickly came to know two men, Admiral Yamamoto, who planned and executed the attack, and Tojo. As Yamamoto was merely a military man and not the main decider for the attack, the hatred and dislike was primarily directed at Tojo. Both American civilians and service members mentioned Tojo in their diaries. He was often talked about and was the face of the enemy, much like Hitler was for Nazi Germany. When Tojo became prime minister in October 1941, and in the months following until December, he was at the focal point of American news reports. A poll from November 1941 found out that 52% of Americans believed that the US would be at war with Japan at some point in the future. So the appointment of Tojo was a major headline in the US, the attack on Pearl Harbor obviously as well, and him stepping down was another major headline. But what about Koiso? What did the American public think about him? What did the American government think about him? As it seems to be an unlucky constant in this man's life, the Americans mostly ignored him. The American government by that point had adopted a policy of no talks with Japan, demanding an unconditional surrender. Even if the Japanese government would try to initiate peace talks through neutral countries, such as Sweden, the Americans and the British firmly decided to not respond to any such requests. The resignation of Tojo was seen by the Americans as evidence that the military strategy worked, inflicting so many losses on Japan that Tojo had to step down. By that point in the war, the Americans were already drafting plans for occupation and post-war Japan. Whoever was in charge in Japan was of little importance to them, especially because they considered Koiso to be a continuation of the hardline military dictatorship of Tojo. Sources are not entirely clear on whether or not the Americans knew about how powerless Koiso actually was, and how much he was ignored by his own army, but it hardly mattered. The decisions were being made on the battlefield, and all America was ready to hear from Tokyo was an unconditional surrender, and it barely mattered who would say these words. But what about the average American? What about the servicemen fighting in the Pacific? Again, he virtually never gets mentioned. For the average American serviceman, the more pressing issue was fighting and surviving against the jungle, malaria, insects and the Japanese soldiers, not some political development thousands of kilometers away in Tokyo. Koiso, unlike Tojo, had no shock moment, no Pearl Harbor event. Japan was already at war with the US. The fighting was already fueled by mutual hatred until the brink, and for the average American, it really didn't matter who was at the helm in Tokyo. The average newspaper reader, e.g. civilian in the US, may came across his name in the newspaper articles about Japanese politics at some point, but American newspapers were much more concerned with reports about the advancement of Allied troops, both in Europe and the Far East, than to write long, boring articles about some random Japanese politicians. I do believe that the average American, and perhaps even the political leadership of the US, were unaware of just how powerless Koiso really was. He was seen as the embodiment of Japanese military dictatorship, when in reality, the army was running a military dictatorship without caring much about Koiso. Koiso's tenure as prime minister can only be described as failure. He obviously failed to stop the Allied advance. His weird attempt at trying to make peace with China by contacting some random imposter can only be described as embarrassing. And the fact that the army largely conducted warfare without even telling him about their plans illustrates his powerlessness. Koiso was prime minister during an interesting time. His tenure started right after the terrible defeat at Saipan, and concluded with American forces landing on Okinawa. His resignation, on April 7th, incidentally fell on the same day the battleship Yamato, the biggest battleship ever built in history, a symbol of the Japanese Navy, was sunk by the Americans. From a military history perspective, there were many interesting campaigns and battles, and many terrible Japanese defeats, in that period. It was a period in which the Japanese army leadership brutally started to realize that the war was lost. The Americans were taking island after island. Every new naval battle the Japanese entered brought new losses for them, culminating in the Battle of the Leyte Gulf, which finally brought any large-scale operations of the Japanese Navy to an end. The terrible bombing campaign on Japan that began in early 1945, and everything went completely south for Japan. The army leadership was nervous, panicking, and realizing that the war was lost. And not only that, they also realized that their own lives might be at stake. They knew that it was the US' ultimate goal to force an unconditional surrender of Japan. And amidst all of this nervousness, chaos, and bitterization, the one thing they did not care about was some civilian prime minister. In a way, Koiso's appointment was one of Tojo's greatest victories. In just a few years, he managed to turn Japan into a total military dictatorship, in which the civilian government was nothing more than a paper tiger. The army had complete control about the country and warfare, and Koiso could do nothing about it. The only one who could and eventually did stand up to the army was the emperor himself, who was the deciding factor in bringing about the Japanese capitulation in August 1945. If it wasn't for his direct intervention, Japan might have continued the fighting. But Koiso was not the emperor. Thank you all for listening, and I hope I see you in the next video. The sources are listed in the video description, and if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. This was an interesting video to make. This is probably the longest I've ever spent on editing a video. Not to say that the normal way of transcribing and translating videos don't take time, but obviously doing something like this takes even longer. I had to write the script, I had to find all the materials, the photos, the videos. I had to edit all that. You know, my video editing skills are not good, so this is just like basic stuff, but it still took me a long time. I know that this will probably be one of the least watched videos on the channel. That's completely fine. Koiso is such a niche figure, and in general I know that not a lot of you are interested in Japan World War II content, but to me it's just super interesting, and Koiso is really one of the most interesting leaders of any nation in World War II to me, just because he is so obscure and so unknown. And this is not even in just in Western sources, also in like Japanese sources. There's very little about him. You know, Tojo is obviously Tojo, he's famous, and then we have Suzuki, the guy who ended the war, which, you know, gave him some popularity. But Koiso just falls in between, and no one really cares about him. I had to look up really obscure sources, often Japanese sources, that I had to translate. The English sources available on Koiso are very few and short. I also had to cut out and shorten many segments in this video. For example, the entire China situation was actually really weird. Like, Koiso tried to approach this one guy, and I don't even know how he knew him, but he was like, yeah, I can contact the defense minister of China, and initially the army was also on board, but then the foreign minister just gathered evidence that this was like an imposter who probably just wanted Japanese secrets, like army secrets and industry secrets, so he could sell it to the Chinese government. Like, he was just in it for the money. It's a really weird story, and it doesn't often get talked about. It's just like one paragraph in most articles, but it's really weird. There's also one segment where So basically the main way Koiso was informed about Japan's wartime policy was that the army would tell the emperor and the emperor would tell Koiso, because the army just simply refused to give Koiso any updates or information. So the emperor had to tell Koiso about the war situation, which was really weird. I also cut out a segment where I talked about how Germany reacted to Koiso, which, obviously in July and August they were like really busy with losing their own wars on two fronts, in Normandy and on the Eastern Front. And initially they were kind of scared that Koiso would make separate peace with the US, because then America could send more soldiers to Europe. But when they eventually found out that really nothing was going to change, they didn't really care much. I mean, at that point, diplomacy was basically over for Germany anyways, and the cooperation with Japan was never really substantial. So this is one thing that I had to cut out. Goebbels mentioned Koiso in his diary like 1 or 2 times. I had to cut out detailed segments about how the army actually prevented Koiso from becoming war minister. I read through like 20 or 30 letters from American servicemen in the Pacific around that time who never once mentioned Koiso. I'm sure if you dig deep enough, someone will eventually mention him, but it's funny how often Tojo gets mentioned in soldiers' letters, and how Tojo became like a synonym for Japanese soldier, but Koiso never appears. It was also incredibly hard to find footage of Koiso. I originally planned to only use footage of him for the entirety of the video, but I quickly realized that this is impossible. There is exactly one piece of footage that shows him before he became prime minister, which is this 20-second long snippet of him planting rice in Korea as governor general in August 1943. That seems to be the only piece of footage of him before he became prime minister. But even afterwards, there is not a lot of footage of him, and this late in the war, Japanese propaganda newsreels emphasized the generals more. They emphasized the soldiers and the pilots more. And there is really not a lot of footage that shows him. Most of it is him during one of his very few public speeches that he gave. There was one in particular that was hosted after, I think, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where the Japanese initially thought they won, and so they made this big celebration parade in Tokyo where Koiso spoke. Most of the other footage is him speaking in parliament. As you know, Japan still had a rubber stamp parliament back then, where both the prime minister and the army ministers would regularly give updates over the situation, the war situation. These were also filmed. But yeah, there's not a lot of footage, and also not really a lot of pictures as well. Like, one of the earliest pictures that I could find of him is this, which is a picture that shows him as commander of the 51st Infantry Division. So already in his 40s, there's no pictures of him like as a young officer or even like as a young boy or something, which you can easily find for Tojo. I believe that, there probably are pictures of him, but they're not online. So, even when it comes to media sources, Japanese sources as well, they don't really have a lot of stuff about him. Tojo, there's a lot of stuff about Tojo. You can buy entire books about him, picture collections. There's hundreds, thousands of pictures of him online. But for Koiso, not so much, which was another challenge in making this video, like what kind of background footage. So I often had to use other footage, just like war newsreels and other kind of footage that I had lying around, because I couldn't show footage of Koiso because there simply isn't enough. Their own propagandists didn't really care all that much to put him in the newsreels, which they did for Tojo. Tojo appeared quite a lot in almost every Japanese newsreel. He was always there, but Koiso, even his own propaganda people considered him unimportant, which is a certain irony in that, I think. I also found this really weird website that sold t-shirts with his face. Apparently they sell t-shirts with all Japanese prime ministers' faces, so if you want to spend your money on a Koiso t-shirt, there you go. There's in general like some weird drawings and illustrations about him. Like I found these two online. He looks kind of cute in there, but I don't really know who draws these. But yeah. Again, I know not a lot of people will care, and so that's completely fine. But I just wanted to do this for myself, and if only like 5 or 10 people find it interesting, that would be enough already for me. I find it super interesting. If you have any more questions about Koiso, feel free to drop them in the comments. And again, thank you for watching and listening, and I hope I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Goodbye.